بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
Salam, hello, bonjour. Welcome to the Adnan Hussein Show. I'm Adnan Hussein, a professor of medieval Mediterranean world history at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. And before I introduce today's topic and my wonderful guest, I'm excited to have a conversation. I wanted to remind listeners and viewers that this is a new channel. If you're on podcast, please rate, review, and share it with friends and on social media. And if you're watching on YouTube, please take a moment now to like the video, subscribe to this new channel, share it on social media, and feel free to comment respectfully on the video, because I think dialogue and interaction is very important on these significant things that we need to think about and discuss together. And I hope to do some live streams in the future to even enhance the opportunity for that kind of engagement. And finally, I have to just mention this is a new channel, and video production and editing is still expensive despite all these wonderful technologies that help us. And I have an editor and producer to help me. So if you'd like this project to continue and have more discussions and analysis and comment on history, politics, global affairs, religion, and culture from a decolonizing, anti-capitalist, and Muslim liberation theological perspective, please do consider supporting, if you can, by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Adnan Hussein. Of course, all content will be free and available to the public, because the whole point is to disseminate ideas and have these sorts of discussions. And one thing that we've been discussing on the channel very recently is the longue durée history of race and racism in the project of the so-called West. And we recently had an excellent conversation with Dr. Ambareen Dadaboy on her recent book, Shakespeare, Islamic Worlds, that examined racial and other forms of difference, constructing early modern European culture and literature. And of course, many of you will be aware that I'm working on compatible subjects in the formation of the Crusading Society, which I discussed recently on a podcast that I know is valued by my guest. Millennials are killing capitalism. So we've been thinking and talking about this. And my guest today, Dr. Alana Lentin, has made a major contribution to this approach in a new book, The Racial Regime, Recalibrations of White Supremacy. Thanks for joining us, Alana, today for discussion of this new work.
Thanks so much for
It's
having me. I'm delighted.
To have you here. For listeners and viewers who don't already know her and her work, I'll just tell them a little bit about you, that you are a professor of cultural and social analysis at Western Sydney University and a member of its Institute for Culture and Society. You're a founding collective member of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism, and I think we'll be talking a little bit about that critical study of it and the deployments of anti-Semitism in the new racial regimes recalibrations later in this conversation, but also author of numerous works on the critical theorization of race, racism, and anti-racism, including several previous books, Racism and Anti-Racism in Europe, co-authored The Crisis of Multiculturalism, Racism in a Neoliberal Age, and recently in 2020, Why Race Still Matters. So there's a long history of work of really profound and important conceptualization of race, anti-racism. And we're here to talk a little bit about your latest thinking since that book in 2020. So I wanted to maybe by having listeners and viewers understand a little bit more about your conceptualization and use of a racial regime analysis. What is a racial regime? How is it old? How is it new? From what I understand from Cedric Robinson's theory and your analysis and deepening of it in response to more contemporary expressions of white supremacy is that it's always kind of new in the sense that it always needs to adjust resistance and update itself in various ways. But maybe you can take us through a little bit first, just what is this concept of the racial regime and how it relates, broadly speaking, to the concept, or at least the analysis that many people would be familiar from Black Marxism and racial capitalism.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me and for this really generous introduction. So, yeah, let me try to put it, in the terms that make sense to me. I think, everybody who works on race generally understands that we can't really do justice to an understanding of the very basic question that many of us are contending with, which is, I guess, the question I was trying to answer in my last book, with the question why race still matters. In other words, why is race still a problem? Why is race continuing to challenge us? So many people, from Stuart Hall to Sivanandan, and before them many other activists and scholars, have always talked about race being this shape-shifting force, race adapting to a variety of contexts, race being chameleon-like. All of these kinds of explanations of race have been kind of put forth. And other people have also used the concept of the racial regime in various ways, although quite differently, I think, to the ways in which Robinson is intending it. So, I was, as you've said, working for a long time on questions of race and really trying to think about its politics, its politicization, its changing nature over time, looking at it in conjuncture with various other, problems of the day. So, for example, in the 2010s, along with my co-author Gavin Titley, examining this notion that multiculturalism is now in crisis or that it's defunct. I've written, substantially about the whole notion of post-racialism and what that masks. And these are all questions that have become familiar to many of us over previous decades. And I guess in the couple of years before I wrote Why Race Still Matters, which is really a book that, dealt with things I'd been thinking about for, I guess, more or less the sort of 7 to 8 years before that book came out, I started to engage with the work of Cedric Robinson, as many people did at the time. Sadly, I think it took people, for him to die, sadly, for many people to start engaging seriously with his work again, outside of a circle of people who were familiar with him and close to him over the 40 years since the publication of Black Marxism, the first publication in 1983. And there are various explanations that, particularly Robin Kelly and Josh Myers, his biographer, have given as to why Black Marxism didn't receive the same kind of treatment as other works by Black radical scholars and other scholars of race over the years. So, as with many other people, I read Black Marxism and engaged as much as I could with the ways in which Robinson was conceptualizing racial capitalism. Also entered into debates with others about the misconceptual, or at least the misunderstanding of racial capitalism in Robinson's terms, which I won't take a detour into, because we could be here all day. But I think what really helped me, and I think this connects to what you were saying before about your work on the Crusades and other people's work, for example, Amberine and other people working on the kind of early modern history of race, is that Robinson really presents us with this notion that, contra the dominant feeling among race scholars or race critical scholars, race has to be thought of as being beyond modernity. This is already a debate that somebody like Charles Mills had been having for several years before this. And it really caused me to think again about many precepts that I had about when to date race, which I don't think is, it's not just a sort of a theoretical or an academic question. It's really allows us to think, well, what are the foundations of race, and therefore to think more clearly about why it continues to, cause all of the kind of harms that it continues to cause. And so Robinson's location of the sort of the foundations of race, or racialism, as he calls it, as foundational to the very birth of the idea of Europe and leading to Western civilization, and then into colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade and all the rest of it, really helped me to kind of resituate this. But what it doesn't do sufficiently, and this is why somebody like, for example, I cite in the book Yusuf al-Balushi, also Joshua Myers, to return to him again, emphasize that you can't really understand how it is that racial capitalism extends across the globe without paying a lot of attention to the processes of reproduction that actually bring this about in this recursive sense or this recalibrating sense. And that's where Robinson's 2007 book, Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, comes in, which is a book that's been much less widely read in recent times than Black Marxism has. And Forgeries is ostensibly, well, it is a book about American cinema, and in particular, as Robinson puts it, the invention of the Negro through American cinema at a particular time, which he calls the racial regime of the 19th century, the late 19th century, at which time you have a kind of a shift in the American empire from kind of putting a full stop at the point of full colonization of Turtle Island and moving into its role that we're now familiar with as, an imperial force across the globe. And the invention of this, the characterization, the figuration of the Negro serves the function that the US empire requires, both domestically and globally, in order to present itself in a particular way and to justify its role as a colonizing imperial force in the world. But the part that Robinson brings to the story, as he always does, is that this is never fixed, this is never set, this is never a question that is, finished, because you always have resistance to it. So in the book, he pays a lot of attention to the ways in which Black filmmakers themselves work against the production of this figure of the Negro with varying success. So what he gives us is this notion of a racial regime, which, as he puts it, is always stitched from old cloth with new. In other words, it kind of recursively returns to old themes of race in their various dimensions: biological and natural, cultural, religious, the national, and so on. What he calls kind of this fictions of memory and the immutable. He calls it a covering conceit of memory and the immutable, which are stitched together constantly, but always in response to this pushback from below, which presses constantly on the weak points of the racial regime and pushes it to have to rethink again and return and renew.
That's really helpful elucidation of the concept. What it reminds me is that the first part of your book some picks up on something that's very important to me: the sense that the racial regime, and why it's so important to specify in a work like the later work on the cinema and the construction of a representation of the Negro through, the American Negro through this racial regime, is that it has to take place in a historical context to be able to uncover the layers of those interlocking formulations, because one of the key components of racial capitalism and is obscuring its own, obscuring the history, the genuine history. And so that's something that you discuss, I think, really nicely in the first couple of chapters, is what's at stake in these histories. And you also, of course, refer to a wonderful point that Cedric Robinson raises in Black Marxism, that, referring to his work, that the work required a certain destructuring of American and Western historiography. For the realization of new theory, we require new history. This is put in, I think, a profound juxtaposition to some of the controversies around actual attempts, resistant attempts that emerge from, ethnic studies, Black studies, Indigenous studies, to, present a different historiography of the foundation of the nation, or, in the case of American academics, or, in other settler colonial contexts, and how important then, which you study is and analyze, I think, interestingly. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about it, is the way in which these resistant histories are contested and advance the updating or recalibration of white supremacy. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that point of origin in this book, dealing with critical race theory, and some of the other work of history that is being produced and or anathematized, as the case may be, and what's at stake in those investments in a certain kind of vision of history.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, maybe I just need to take a step back and explain a little bit about how this book came about. After I published the last book, quite soon after, as everybody remembers, suddenly this war on critical race theory was declared. And it was towards the end of Trump 1.0, if we can call it that, that you started to see these declarations of critical race theory being this nefarious force that was infecting young minds and that was being taught everywhere from kindergarten up through university, that was responsible for, what the now much maligned diversity, equity, and inclusion policies within local government, municipalities, you name it, private companies. Walt Disney Company was, lambasted by somebody like, DeSantis in Florida. I mean, these are things that we now sort of have forgotten very quickly, because the next horror, the ramped up horror of Trump 2.0 is now upon us. But all of these things lay the ground for what we are seeing now. It's not just something that just emerged one day because Trump came back to office. The ground was being laid very much during the Biden era. And so I wanted to write a short response to this so-called war on critical race theory. And it was quite interesting because I was met with some pushback from some people who were wondering, well, will this really be on the agenda by the time you finish writing it and it comes out? Like, will we still be talking about this? Which I wish we weren't needing to talk about it anymore, but it was very obvious to me, as I said before, as somebody who'd kind of been studying over the years the various iterations of these kinds of things in the past, that we would indeed still be talking about it. But what happened was all this kind of waiting around for people to decide whether or not they, and I will say Pluto were very happy to publish it from the beginning. We just had a bit of tinkering over like where it would appear and so on. So the question is not with them, but waiting around to get a contract signed and all the rest of it. Time is moving on. These things are changing. We were talking about critical race theory, and then we were talking more generally about woke. And of course, there was this attachment again to the attack on transgender people and LGBTQIA plus people in general, all of these things coming together. So the thing was getting more and more ramped up, and other people were starting to respond to, obviously, these attacks on critical race theory. Interestingly, one of the things I mentioned in the book, which is not to critique anybody, but there was this tendency to use this as a teachable moment to kind of come in and say, well, no, actually, critical race theory is not what you're saying that it is. It's actually all of these other things. And I think that's really useful for us as academics and as students, and, obviously also for the general public to know what is this thing that's being called critical race theory. But very often, what you'd hear people say is like, oh, no, don't worry, it's not actually being taught here and there and everywhere, right? Which is a strange kind of very defensive way of approaching the topic. And so obviously the question was, well, it's not about whether or not people understand what critical race theory is, because what's at stake here is a wholesale attack on any kind of knowledge building that emerges from Black radical, indigenous, anti-colonial thinking that tries to attack, and I use that word advisedly because it's Cedric Robinson's word in this essay that I discuss in the last chapter of the book. The first attack is an attack on culture. Very important. And he says it also at the end of Black Marxism, that he had 3 points of attack. So he uses this word. The idea is to attack the bases of Western civilization that give us race, that give us colonialism, that give us imperialism, that give us oppression. That was what this knowledge building was for. And for this reason, it had to be attacked. As, in the past, affirmative action or political correctness, or obviously Black studies, ethnic studies, everything had been attacked before. The name being given to this counterinsurgency coming from the state and, forces on the right, but also, as I show in the book, some forces on the left, on the white left, wanted to go against the idea that people themselves were going to tell, as Du Bois would say, the truth about history, rather than regurgitate the received, the dominant accounts that are being foisted on people from within not just the dominant education system, but also obviously popular culture, media, and now, as we're seeing, from the high echelons of government, direct repression in the form of deportation and detention if you think and have a thought, and as Charisse Berdenselli said, act upon the thinking that would lead you to the logical conclusion that the only thing you can do in the face of genocide, in the face of imperialism, is to take action against it. So it's not just, and this is where Robinson comes in, because he says at a certain point, it's not just about, when he talks about the need to destructure Western historiography and that for new theory we require new history, he's not saying, well, please include us within the curriculum. So this is where, you know, we can start to have a critique of tendencies towards decolonizing the curriculum, or you know, diversity measures, or even anti-racist education of various forms, if the structure, the container remains the same, and what you're being given is a few kinds of opportunities, even things that look quite radical on their face in terms of the content, but if they don't trouble at all the setting in which all of this is saying, Robinson is saying, well, that's not what we're asking for. We're not asking to be included. We're asking for an entire destructuring of the very bases, the epistemological bases upon which we're writing history. And that would require, if we were to take it to the logical conclusion, my reading of that is that that would require an entire destructuring of the, what I'm calling the containers, so the Western Academy, the public and private education system, and the state itself, right? And obviously that is a bridge too far if, you know, the current state of affairs, the dominant hegemonic state of affairs, is going to be able to sustain itself. And as we can see, it's undergoing sustained attack from below, and that's why there are so many efforts to repress anybody who's taking any stance against it, even the most liberal and milk toast way.
Yes, yeah. I think that's an interesting and important point to remember, because you've just begun to also introduce the ways in which institutions can appropriate. One of the responses of the recalibration of white supremacy is to find ways to, you know, create liberal inclusion narratives, DEI, corporate DEI, you know, policies that engender their own resistance, but are still part of a liberal, racial, you know, capitalist model. And you do a lot of excellent work in chapter 3, talking about, for example, the way in which dissent gets incorporated into institutionally allowable forms of critique and analysis. And in some sense, what you did by beginning with talking about the controversies over critical race theory and history and narration of history is also demonstrate some of the limits of the assertion of those kinds of approaches, because they could easily be incorporated in various ways in institutional settings, because if you don't really break the container that you were talking about, or, you know, strive to, in essence, if you ignore the problem of colonialism and imperialism, which is something that is really, it strikes me that you would agree with me that that's really where the foundations of this kind of system really falter, you know, in finding ways to accommodate a genuine anti-imperialist analysis. And so perhaps you could talk a little bit more about how you critiqued and analyzed the way in which, during an ongoing genocide, there was a kind of institutionalization or recovery in certain ways of some forms of dissent, and what that produces.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I should say this book can be seen, I think, quite clearly as existing in two parts, in the sense that I began to write it in 2022. And I finished, so the introduction is almost like a standalone chapter, in the sense that it's almost as long as any of the other chapters. So I finished the introduction, the first chapter, and the second chapter. The first chapter being on the war and critical race theory, the second chapter being on history and technologies of white forgetting, that we've somewhat discussed now. And I finished those by the end of 2023. It was really a long process, I think, to get all those parts right. And then, of course, Israel began this phase of its genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza. And I was to sit down to write the next chapter at the beginning of 2024. So everything had to be reevaluated. In the last book, I also had a chapter which is called Good Jew, Bad Jew, which basically contends with the politicization of anti Semitism. And I always wanted to discuss that in the book. But the question of Palestine obviously became much more prominent because it simply couldn't be ignored morally, I think, but also in terms of how much what's going on illustrates so much of the arguments that I was making in the book. So I had to have a kind of a rethink. So chapter 3 was always going to begin as it does, which is with the very strange case of the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, and his appreciation for critical race theory, which is then very quickly jumped on by the Black historian Keisha Blaine and Ibram X. Kendi, who both commend him for being, I think, I can't remember the exact quote, but like one of the strongest defenders of critical race theory, which is very interesting as I then come back to remark in chapter 4, because of Keisha Blaine was quite vociferously critiqued for accepting the Dan David Prize, which is a prize which is given out by the Israeli government for history, for the study of history. I think it's a $300,000 prize. So it's quite interesting. So what I was trying to do in that chapter was to think about themes that many other people are thinking about. One of the most prominent people whose work I cite in the chapter, who's also a member of the founding collective of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism, is Dylan Rodriguez, that many people will be familiar with, and his work on counterinsurgency. And here I was really using also frameworks from Orasami Burton's book, Tip of the Spear, and the idea of the institutionalization of dissent comes from that work there. But other people have already noted, I'm thinking about Arun Kundnani and his book on anti-racism recently, the ways in which things like anti-racism, critical race theory, DEI, and so on have been used in a counterinsurgent manner in order to, muddy the waters, as it were. And, there are many examples of the employees of Lockheed Martin doing unconscious bias training workshops and things like that. And I think we're all familiar, or many of us, let's say, are familiar with these processes. And many of us have for years been critical of, the institutionalization of DEI. I mean, one of our arguments in the crises of multiculturalism was that it was ironic that because the anti-racist left had been critical of multiculturalism for decades and had seen it as a hegemonic project that was being foisted upon Black and minority ethnic communities in order to tame and domesticate Black radicalism, and not just Black radicalism, but in the UK context that Paul Gilroy writes about very early on in There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, which came out in 1987. He was talking about the alliance between Black and white and Asian working class youth, right? So we had all of these critiques at our fingers. And then, of course, when people like David Cameron, who is the Prime Minister of the UK, or Angela Merkel as the German Chancellor, were coming out in the early 2000s and saying multiculturalism is dead, then everybody now has to rush to defend multiculturalism. So here we see the same thing again. So obviously on the left, we've always had this critique of saying, don't be rushing to save this stuff, because this is exactly the kind of thing that's, being used as a counterinsurgent force against any kind of radical critique from the beginning. And I think that argument is there. And what I tried to do in the first part of the chapter is to show very clearly how this works in the case of Zionist counterinsurgency. And we can see, one of the quotes was actually from a tweet by a student, I think she was at Princeton, who talks about being arrested in the office of DEI, which is just, such a kind of an excellent summary of everything that's been happening within the context of the pro-Palestine encampments. But I wasn't really satisfied with leaving it there, because if we think about the starting point for the book, which is looking at this so-called war on critical race theory, what I was really interested in was thinking more deeply about our own, our own epistemologies, our own tools of analysis, and to start to think about whether or not they are fit for purpose if we want to try to understand a problem that's been pressing on a lot of people in the context of this genocide, which is why is there so much silence from figures who, if we were to read their work, we would assume would be the first people to be speaking out against genocide. And the explanation from fear or anxiety about losing one's job and all of those things, which affect everybody, right, who has spoken out on these, they're not sufficient for me, in a sense that they only go so far to explain. So I wanted to go a little bit deeper and think about, well, what is there within the epistemologies of critical race theory that can help us to explain these silences? And this is not to say that, there's been an across the board silence from all critical race theorists. Of course, that's far from being the truth. There are many outspoken critical race theorists in this context. So I'm not interested in kind of pointing the finger at anyone. I'm much more interested in whether or not, as a tool of analysis, critical race theory does the work that it needs to do in order to be able to parse this moment and the context, the genocide, genocides in general, right? And actually, if you start to look at foundational critical race theory, and here it's really important, and I'm sure you're aware, and other people's are, but very often there's a slippage between critical race theory per se and critical race theory as it's used in a more kind of loose sense. Kimberly Crenshaw, who, as we know, is one of the founders of critical race theory, herself said that we tend to use critical race theory interchangeably in the way that we use Kleenex to say tissue, or at least Americans do that. We don't say that, but anyway, so we understand what we're talking about. So my point is not critical race studies in general. My point is really to look at critical race theory itself as a movement that begins in the 1980s under the guidance of Derek Bell, and what is it actually set up to do, and whether or not it can do the work that it needs to do. So if you go to the foundational text of critical race theory, you can actually see that it has quite a narrow remit, which is to really, look at the premises of white supremacism within the US legal system, and by extrapolation within institutions basically of the US state. And you can use similar methodologies to look at how this works in other raceocracies, to use Barner Hesse's term. But it isn't able to do the work of actually understanding where all of that sits within a much longer durée of imperialism and colonialism, and doesn't sufficiently, specifically from an indigenous, critical indigenous studies perspective, do the work of thinking where, anti-Black racism that's foundational to US racial capitalism to a certain extent has to be thought of in relation to, the existence of US racial capitalism within US settler colonialism. Now, one person who's a critical race theorist who's done this in a very important sense is Cheryl Harris, of course, and her work on whiteness as property is deeply influenced, for example, the critical indigenous scholar Aileen Morton Robinson, Goenpul woman who works in Australia. But there have been long-standing critiques made by indigenous and decolonial scholars that critical race theory, outside of some texts like Harris's and very few others, can actually do the work of thinking critically about about the relationship between race and land, rather than just the relationship between race and practices of discrimination. So, I mean, that's kind of where I'm trying to go with it in the chapter, that we need to go beyond these kinds of obvious kind of critiques of the manipulation of ideas of, or even just motifs of critical race theory and allied terms, but we need to actually look epistemically at its bases, and then to try to think about how can we work with it nonetheless. So none of this is about throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but rather following, for example, the approach of the British sociologist Ali Megji, who talks about a theoretical synergy between CRT and decolonial approaches, and indigenous studies scholars who've tried to indigenize critical race theory. So there are various ways in which this can be done, and those conversations are happening, but they're not very often linked to the more political problems that critics have pointed out with academic critical race theory, if you like.
Interesting. I realized also that maybe we did skip over a little bit of some of the arguments of the white forgetting, which both cases that you were looking at were, I think, principally generated within settler colonial contexts, which is a useful thread to get us into the next conversation topic here, which I think is building on the point of indigenizing, some of these race theories has been a very important move and contribution that has reconfigured some of the uh, kind of perspective and approaches in a very fruitful and necessary sort of way. And in some sense, I think it is perhaps, as I was thinking during the campus movements and the Gaza encampments, and so on, and the repression that followed that you've been alluding to about, the institutionalized, dissent in the time of genocide, and that you develop much more in subsequent chapters in this book. Um, that at the time, I thought one of the ways of thinking about what's going on here is that, regardless of whatever people's critiques might have been about some of the ways in which the analysis was framed and so on, it is clear that uh, critiques of settler colonialism had clearly taken root and stuck in a way that was severely challenging to some of the institutionalizing of dissent, and it was a disruption of that. And that seemed to be a very important kind of point and realization that bringing together an analysis of settler colonialism and, as you do, racial capitalism, and how that resistance to that then required these recalibrations of white supremacy in this racial regime, I think was very fruitful analysis. I wanted to move to talking a little bit about that and just reminding listeners that the new racial regime that you're talking about are interlocking sets of responses. Okay, so these are all connected, but they're also distinct responses to various problems, that emerge out of resistance. And so this kind of question of the counterinsurgent capture of indigeneity, that it seems that it follows directly from the fact that analysis of settler colonialism and racial capitalism had come together in a pretty powerful and radical critique of the the status quo, that has led to and the solidarity between different forms of resistance, decolonization struggles of settler colonial locations around the world, and the understanding that they were part of a similar kind of process, that their structural relations and so on had led likewise to Zionist kind of cultivation of a discourse of indigeneity in particular ways to make and forge connections and disrupt others. Just as you were, I see chapter 3 and 4 as really going well together. One is predominantly about attempts to disrupt Black Palestinian solidarity in some ways, the politics of that, and then in the other, indigenous and Palestinian, indigenous in Western settler colonial societies that have been more successful in establishing the settler colonial regime without like the level of resistance that is still ongoing in Palestine. That those solidarity of indigenous peoples in those locations with the people of Palestine was something that had to be really responded to. So I'm wondering if maybe you could share a little bit more of your, I thought, very cogent and illuminating analysis. What are some of the implications of this move to capture indigeneity and its moves, that you deconstruct and analyze?
Yeah, like, indigenous scholars and activists have for a really long time been talking about the problems of self-indigenization, and the appropriation of indigeneity by settlers. And there's so much interesting work on that that I wasn't going to replicate. But where I thought that I could intervene was in terms of this specific question of the manipulation of this notion of Jewish indigeneity to, we would say, Palestine. Of course, they wouldn't say that. And I wanted to look at that within the context of, as you say, this kind of backlash against taking a settler colonial analysis of the current conjuncture, and particularly of the genocide. So this is an analysis that would go against a kind of a more liberal frame of the Palestinian struggle that would see it from a perspective of humanitarianism or perhaps questions of equality and democracy, that the settler colonial frame, and really I'm thinking about that has been mounted by Palestinian activists and scholars for many decades. I mean, it's not something new. And as many Palestinian scholars have said, I'm thinking of Rana Barakat, for example, has critiqued, the white settler colonial studies that emerged out of predominantly Australia, and thinking critically with some of its tools, but also what it kind of elides, what it neglects, what it obscures in terms of that Palestinian and indigenous critique that, predates the kind of the realization of white historians that, oh my God, there's a thing called settler colonialism that we might have to deal with because we're actually the beneficiaries of it, right? So I didn't want to again replicate those things, but I wanted to think very critically about how we can understand again epistemically the dangers of other processes that actually weren't new, but that were ongoing for some time, although relatively recent, towards the indigenization, or they call it indigenization, but we can call it like creation of spaces for indigenous knowledge within colonial institutions, colonial academic institutions. And I was thinking that there's this kind of way of understanding how that affords this concept of Jewish indigeneity, because we're seeing this kind of very top-down effort to indigenize, to create these kind of indigenizing practices within universities, where universities are kind of capturing what are radical demands of indigenous people and folding them into institutions that again are not being held up to any scrutiny as such. So even when we have language that sounds quite radical, that we need to talk about the colonial bases of the institution of the university, we need to talk about the colonial bases of knowledge, and we hear these things regularly said in our seminar rooms, but it doesn't actually have an impact on where power lies within the institution. In fact, we might argue just, from a cursory look around, that in fact the power of these institutions has grown exponentially, even though they're being attacked, obviously from the administration in the US, but everywhere else, we're seeing this kind of, these bastions being involved in lockstep with the police and so on in the wholesale repression of any kind of, indeed, anti-colonial radicalism that is precisely, going at the basis of settler colonialism. And so I was interested in this dynamic that we're seeing, at least locally in Australia, around the notion of self-determination in Indigenous education. So this is a mantra that started to be heard within these colonial academic institutions. And I found it very interesting that this concept of self-determination, which of course Indigenous people aspire to, and that we could argue that the Palestinian struggle is part of, it can be so easily incorporated by these institutions in order to basically capitalize on areas of knowledge building with regards to Indigenous studies that can only exist in a very particular format. So they can work in the cultural domain, and lots of Indigenous scholars like Aileen Morton Robinson again has critiqued the culturalization of Indigenous struggles. But there's a direct knock-on effect that she and, for example, Elizabeth Polvinelli in an earlier work also critiqued. So the idea that you can only have access to recognition in terms of your Indigenous authenticity if you can perform a certain number of culturalist maneuvers that are rubber stamped by a colonial anthropological understanding of what is authentically Indigenous, and that this kind of takes away from what the actual Indigenous demand would be, which is, of course, land back, sovereignty, reparations, and decolonization. And so then when we think about efforts to decolonize universities, what do any of these things mean when the actual material practices of what they would logically lead to, which again would be land back, reparations, decolonization, and sovereignty, are completely off the table? And what's on the table are things like, cultural safety is the language that's used in the Australian context, how to build cultural safety for Indigenous people, how to educate white and other non-Indigenous teachers and so on in these frameworks of understanding that would lead to more knowledge about, lost histories of indigenous culture from various perspectives, all of which is, and this is the paradox, the kind of the dialectics that you've been pointing out. All of this is A, very important, B, under attack, C, needs to be preserved because there's been long hard fought struggles for the inclusion of these things, but also we're aware of the moments at which it becomes possible to kind of co-opt and institutionalize and domesticate these frameworks in a way to them, and that comes at precisely the time, like this is intensified at precisely the time that we see a genocide for the self-determination of an Indigenous people being entirely obliterated by the same colonial institutions that are investing a lot of funds in this indigenization process. And in the context, again, of the need to preserve settler colonial entities, we need to ask critical questions about why that's being done now. And I mean, one of the ways in which I look at this is through the prism of the Indigenous Voice to Parliament referendum, which took place, paradoxically, the vote took place on the 14th of October 2023, so just a week after the Al-Aqsa flood. And you had the participation very prominently, and the person I discussed in the book is one particular prominent Zionist activist in Australia who has been involved in Indigenous politics for the last 3 to 4 decades, who was one of the most prominent supporters of this Indigenous Voice to Parliament, at the same time that he's one of the most vociferous opponents of pro-Palestine activists in Australia, and has been involved in all kinds of machinations against them of the kind that we're all familiar with. So I'm thinking about, well, what does all of this mean that we can have somebody, and his open statements are that he is 100% behind Indigenous self-determination or Indigenous sovereignty building because Jews are indigenous to what he would call Israel. So that makes it, and if we put all of that together with the indigenization efforts, the attacks on any kind of pro-Palestine activism, and the fact that the majority of academic institutions in the Australian context were 100% behind this Indigenous Voice to Parliament that was defeated due to a racist vote, but was also highly critiqued and opposed by grassroots Indigenous activists and by many Indigenous people. This kind of creates a very interesting conundrum through which to rethink what does it mean for us to get involved uncritically with decolonizing and indigenizing activities within institutions. But as you're probably hearing, the argument has many different aspects to it, so it's relatively difficult to expose it in a few minutes.
Yeah, no, I definitely, would recommend listeners to pick up the book and study more carefully the detailed analysis to actual examples that you use to elaborate the more conceptual and theoretical, understanding, of this. It does remind me, though, coming back to some of the tension that you've been pointing out, is because there is resistance to any kind of inclusion and memory. And you just discussed that in earlier examples, of white forgetting, in the previous chapter. That's very, important. I mean, what we see is that the flexibility of the racial regime and the way in which it can update, recalibrate, means that there are shifting lines and there are plenty of contradictions available and possible within elements of, liberal forms of white supremacy versus the more aggressive right-wing denialist, but that they all do seem to be predicated on the necessity of various kinds of forgetting. There is a perspective on the past that is very important and useful in delimiting where the boundaries here of what can be remembered. And so the struggle to actually even get in curriculum, in institutional histories, in national kind of recognition and commemoration and so on of any element of that representation is something that is both hard fought and itself such a limitation itself. And that's, I think, one of the kind of problems, is what to hold on to. And, these are practical questions with when there's limited kind of forces for solidarity and resistance, is where do you make these decisions and choices about what to try and defend, because you've invested institutionally in at least getting some kind of form of space and in these curriculums, but it doesn't really achieve that other narrative of history, to just have kind of multicultural sorts of inclusion and all the things that you were kind of talking about that need to be critiqued in these institutional contexts. But one thing that was theoretically significant or important in your analysis about these contestations over history in that chapter about the technologies of white forgetting is itself an idea of history and of time. And you talked about kind of these concepts of time. Linear time is something that's critiqued, and of course in indigenous cultures and discourse globally, there are different ways of experiencing, narrating, thinking time and temporality, that are different from the conventions of history and historiography in kind of Western capitalist racial time. But I wanted to kind of ask about that because as a historian, I have to be almost wedded in some sense to a sense, if not of the conventions of the profession, which I recognize has its institutional locations and perpetuates certain approaches and perspectives that can contribute to white forgetting. For example, that there might be something worth distinguishing between the problem of the linearity of the time in the narration of it in conventional histories that get at what I think Robinson was talking about in terms not the order of things, but not the ordering of things, that is putting them in the appropriate historical and chronological order, but rather the more epistemological order of things that lies behind it. And, I think the techniques of putting things in their proper order or counterposing things that have left out other things that need to be ordered can distinguish between the kind of linearity of temporality, okay, which I think is hard for a historian to give up. Things happen in a certain order, and yet the meaning and the construction of the historiography around it, the narrative, and the purposes by which it kind of forgets certain things in order to remember other things and create a kind of narrative around white supremacy. Those things can maybe be distinguished, but that's a historian's preoccupation. And so I wanted to come back to it and ask you, from your analysis, how do you kind of integrate this kind of critique of linear time and Western narratives of supremacy, civilizational supremacy, racial supremacy, national supremacy, and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a historian. And so the questions that I'm trying to raise are more epistemic questions about how we relate to how the past is narrated. And I think that's where you're right to point that out. This is what exactly to pick up on what Robinson was saying when he says that we need to, completely deconstruct the bases of Western historiography. He's talking about how things, when we talk about historiography, we're talking about the narration of history, not history itself. I mean, we understand that things happen in a sequential order, but then it's all about who gets to tell what happened, right? So things happen, but only certain people, a tiny microcosm of the people in the world, actually get to tell us and teach us officially what happened. And not only do we not listen to other voices, but also masses amounts of effort have been done to obliterate those other sources of knowledge, as we're currently seeing in Palestine with the mass scholasticide, but also over time how the Israeli regime has been involved in attacks for, and I talk about this in the last chapter on the, and the fourth chapter, I think, on the Palestine Research Center and so on. And all colonial occupations across time have always been hell bent on destroying the archive, destroying the knowledge of, on two levels, both physically and materially destroying the knowledge, but also, and this is where Robinson is so important in his essay on the first attack is an attack on culture. And he says, like, the invention of the Negro is an effort to completely distort the African and to caricature her in a very particular, distorted light that has absolutely nothing to do with, indeed, the history of African peoples. So to present people, as we know, in a racist way, which is so foundational to the ability to colonize and to expropriate and to steal, etc. So, and to enslave, of course. So all of this is about how we tell history and who gets to tell history. This is why, for example, I talk briefly about Du Bois in Black Reconstruction in America and his discussion of historians and their very particular and extremely racist analysis of, you know, of the Reconstruction era, and related to debates that were much more recent around the 1619 Project, which, you know, just to recap, was the New York Times publication of this series of essays under the editorship of the journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones, which have been critiqued rightly, not least for her intense patriotism, which you know, she exposes in her essay on democracy, or you know, her basic point, very similarly, by the way, to Kimberly Crenshaw, who I mentioned in chapter 3, who said something like, again, I'm paraphrasing, but something like, if we were to do critical race theory, then that would be something like the perfecting of American democracy. So both of these people have that narrative, and it's very familiar to, particularly to North Americans. You see it over and over again during US elections, where, you know, Black women politicians are held up on this pedestal of saving the entire nation and all this kind of thing. Less present perhaps at the last election, but definitely was the case in the election a few times before with somebody like Stacey Abrams and so on. So anyway, so the point of all of this is to really focus on, you know, so what was going on with the 1619 Project, leaving aside the criticisms of the project from the left, and particularly from an Indigenous perspective, where Indigenous studies academics and so on were talking about, you know, the entire elision of, except in very, very broad lines, of, you know, of settler colonialism and indigeneity, right? Leaving all of that aside and leaving aside the intense patriotism of Hannah-Jones and so on, the basic point that was being made in the 1619 Project, notwithstanding the critiques of whether 1619 was the right date to choose, you know, all of it, we know masses of controversies around this project. So just to make it clear that I'm not there cheering away for the 1619 Project, but very specific point, which is around the way Hannah-Jones uses the so-called people's historian Gerald Horne's work on, you know, the history of the Civil War and the question of, you know, his basically going against this received notion that, you know, this was being fought in order to end slavery. And in fact, he shows very convincingly, as I think many of us know, that this was actually a war to preserve the slave owning class and everything that led on from there. And what I found particularly interesting in that chapter to look at was, rather than thinking about the right-wing attacks, which very much dovetailed with the war on critical race theory from people like Christopher Rufo and company. We know all these people. Trump himself was outraged about the 1619 Project during his, you know, strange conference on American history that he held in the dying days of his last presidency. But really what I found much more interesting was the ways in which all of these characters on the left, you know, got together to attack Gerald Horne, And there are also been attacks from, in a similar vein, on Cedric Robinson from the Marxist left, or the white Marxist left, who basically accused Horne of doing improper history for a particular point, which, as I said in the book, recalling Jay Sakai's book, Settlers, was really about this idea that, Horne's and Sakai's critique, and, you have it also in David Roediger and other people, that the alliance between among the working class was simply missing in action, which is what Nicole Hannah-Jones says in her essay. She says, Black people had to struggle alone. And she was lambasted for this. But Horne basically says, yes, this is historically true for the main part. Obviously, there are outliers. Obviously, there are always people who went against that, but they were in the minority. And the grand majority of white settlers, even people who had been indentured in a previous time, or people who had suffered immense poverty, were able to be incorporated into the white settler class to shore up power against Black and Indigenous people. This is a simple fact of history that completely goes against the fantasies, frankly, that the white left has about the possibilities for Black and white unite and fight, to use that old slogan. So it's kind of returning to those questions of race being the modality in which classes lived, as Stuart Hall put it, which has always been something that the left has been unable to contend with, because we've been sold this lie that identity politics, or something that's being, again, it's like CRT. What do we mean by identity politics? This notion of identity politics or anti-racism, etc., is always going to be a liberal attack on the left, rather than actually being the kind of critique that we all need to get invested in order to understand how we can take a left project forward, which is very much, for example, the argument that the French Algerian decolonial scholar Houria Boutelja is putting forward in her new book, as just one example.
Yes, yes, yeah. No, that's a fascinating and important example. And of course, we've had Gerald Horne on Guerrilla History, the other podcast that I'm associated with, multiple times, and dealt with some of this, of course, about the counter-revolution of 1776 thesis. But what's what's really interesting here is that we've been talking about the way in which these narratives are produced to buttress white supremacist and settler colonial project. And in your work here, you've also been examining the way in which this indigenization has led to a particular, politics around, Zionist sort of claims. And you already discussed to some extent, the way in which, this is a common kind of practice of settler colonists to try and indigenize themselves and create historical narratives about the land being empty, and in order to authorize their own indigeneity and to turn the indigenous into the interloper. And that's something that I myself am trying to work on, is about these narratives that have seemed to have gained force, which is to turn the indigenous into the new kind of barbarian, the new colonizer, in fact, actually, which is what I find so fascinating about these narratives that try and represent a billion Muslims as, colonizers from elsewhere, or hundreds of millions of Arabs as colonizers from elsewhere, that basically take a foundational narrative of scriptural history as a kind of warrant for reconfiguring, hundreds and thousands of years of slow processes in which cultures and human societies change and develop, and people change their religion and then suddenly now become Arabized because they learn to speak Arabic. And, like these slow processes of history that are about migration, movement, cultural change, development, are frozen. And there's a certain kind of time where, this is the time that counts. And I remember speaking with a Palestinian archaeologist who said that he found it so frustrating that only a certain period of Bronze Age history counted in terms of the nature or the identity of the land, and that it made everyone else, if they didn't identify in the same exact way with the same features, of putatively speaking a biblical Hebrew, of tracing their lineage from among various tribes, and practicing in a certain way, that then they were, even if maybe those had been the Jewish peasantry for, centuries, they just stayed, but others came and they changed their religion, or they learned to speak a different language. And then, so this kind of idea really seems to rest on not, it's odd, it's interesting, because on the one hand, it does privilege modern or even contemporary modes and forms of thinking about peoples and who they are, that is clearly a product of nations and nationalism, and of race and racism. Um, but that it also tries to erase historical differences between, say, European projects of colonialism and so called imperialism, because I think it's really the case of nation states colonizing other peoples. It's not the old world sort of empires that were cosmopolitan formations of many peoples. You might have a ruling dynasty who's of a certain ethnicity and religion and so on, but they ruled a diverse population and incorporated them in various ways. It's not that. It's a nation state that has established kind of the terms of political inclusion around racial, ethnic, or linguistic, i.e., national ideas, and then has this broader civilizational narrative that can be used to make an impenetrable barrier for political inclusion, right? That's something that's very different. And in this kind of erasure of history, there's this kind of sense that uh, migration, movement, cultural change, and so on is somehow illegitimate. It is just the same as colonialism, that we know from the 19th century, and that seems to be a discourse that's totally necessary for the re-indigenizing, you might say, of Zionism, of Zionist settlers, of re-indigenizing them, is to basically have to rely upon, the erasure of historical differences and change, and to freeze in a kind of narrative that has purchase in the West. That's the thing that makes it uncontestable for the audience of Christian Zionists or of others, is that, well, it's relying on this kind of already authorized sort of story that's taken then as history. It seemed to me that this is the only way to really understand what you talk about in chapter 5 about these definitions and the extreme broad commitment across the so-called West into anti-antisemitism as something like what the Germans call the Staatsräson. I mean, this is truly remarkable to say, combating, anti-Semitism and supporting, settler colonial state of Israel is the actual reason of existence of this German state. Like, it's the rationale for the German state. So anyway, I wanted to give you an opportunity, in our kind of concluding sort of thoughts about where you come to in this final chapter about studying the anti-antisemitism and its particular valence in the West as a project of recalibrating white supremacy.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, what you started off by saying was how important, by talking about how we specifically home in on very particular eras of history in order to exclude, you know, the breadth and depth of history, basically in order to tell a very particular story, and then to pick up and use ideas such as colonialism and completely turn them on their head in order to completely ignore what is actually meant historically by colonialism from any kind of truthful account. All of this basically ties into what I tried to do in the last chapter, because if we didn't have those technologies of white forgetting, then it would be quite simply impossible for this kind of, you know, dominant, you know, I don't know, like just complete defense of everything that Israel is doing against the Palestinians. So I start off by trying to show or trying to talk about why you have such a kind of a partnership between Zionism and the anti-Semitic far right, because this seems to be a paradox to many people. But actually, if you look at it, if you look at it in detail, what Israel is basically doing, what European states or the proponents of a kind of a long lost era, which is anyway completely fictive, of Europe should be doing in order to stave off what is known as the Great Replacement. So Israel is lauded by somebody like Douglas Murray, the far right British journalist, who's, I call him a far right journalist, but obviously he's accepted on all the mainstream. Former editor of the Spectator magazine, invited on every platform, invited also by left wing people to discuss his ideas as if they're just absolutely neutral. Openly talks in extremely, like, violently Islamophobic and anti-black terms about the so-called War on the West, which is the title of his 2022 book. This man was able to publish in the Jewish Chronicle, the Jewish newspaper of note published since the end of the 1800s in the UK, that Hamas is worse than the Nazis, because according to him, and he said this very early on, I think it was early November 2023, he said that the reason for this is that the Germans, the Nazis at least, tried to hide their crimes, whereas Hamas apparently, openly does it and is proud of killing people and so on, which is rather ironic considering all of the, umpteen TikTok and Instagram videos that Israeli soldiers have so proudly, basically emblazoned all over the internet, which is now coming back to bite them in various ways. But all of this didn't really matter in order for Murray to make the point. The point is not so much what he said, which was disgusting and horrific in its own terms, and actually is a case of Holocaust denial. He was actually denying, it's classic Holocaust denial kind of rhetoric. But the point is not that. It's the point is that he can say it, right? And the point is that there's a kind of an open white supremacist fascism that is permitted because it's expressing support for Zionism and for what Israel is doing against the Palestinians, right? It's very specific things that are permissible to be done and said that would not be permissible when we're talking about any other non-Palestinian and non-Muslim population. It looks like Muslim people and Palestinians are the only people about whom this kind of thing can be said openly, even though we know that Black and African people are regularly submitted. I mean, the issue with that is rather the complete ignorance in terms of the ignoring of everything that's happening to people in Sudan, Congo, and so on and so forth. So my point was to start with that, because I think it's very important to really, begin to expose the ways in which Zionism is not only appreciated by fascism or by fascists, but is really the logical endpoint of racial fascism, because it's a kind of an encapsulation of everything that white supremacism, settler colonialism builds towards, right? It's and the only way in which it can be successful is because of the mobilization of what the Palestinian German scholar Anna Yunus calls the war on anti-Semitism, which she kind of analogizes with the war on drugs and the war on terror in terms of actually being, wars against something completely confected, an enemy object that needs to be invented in order for the state to be able to contain and control and punish certain populations, be it poor Black populations in the US at a particular time, or Muslims in the context of the so-called war on terror, etc. So the war on anti-Semitism kind of counters this figure of the Jew who's requiring of safety and protection by the very forces that construct the problem of the Jew. So I use, for example, Cedric Robinson's discussion of Karl Marx's On the Jewish Question in this essay, The First Attack is an Attack on Culture, which is an essay that Robinson wrote about, again, a question that's very prominent throughout all his work, which is the invention of the Negro and the need to attack that. So he says that the very first thing that the Black radical intelligentsia had to do is to attack this figure, this invented figure of the Negro, in order to be able to reconstruct African peoples, the dignity and truth about African peoples, because without doing that, you couldn't get beyond this point. So he was saying it was the same. He draws from Karl Marx's discussion of the Jewish question to show that contra mainstream or dominant understandings of what Marx was trying to do in this essay, Marx is not actually talking about the Jew, but he's talking about German society, which requires a Jew. So analogizing or building on that for our present moment, obviously European civilization for its continuation requires a Jew, right? I mean, this Jew doesn't necessarily have to be Jewish, but is today Jewish, right? And particularly Zionist, which is why you have now, through these definitions of anti-Semitism that are incorporated into law, for example, the Civil Rights Act of the United States, which contains the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, you have this sudden invention of Zionism as a protected identity category, like race, religion, nationality, etc. Right? So this figure needs to be created and protected, not for the actual protection of Jews, because the definition of anti-Semitism that's been incorporated is completely counterposed to the existence of anti-Zionist Jews. So it's not a defense against anti-Semitism, because the worst forms of anti-Semitism that we can see enacted today are enacted by Israel and its defenders and supporters against Jews who don't agree with Zionism, be they secular anti-Zionist Jews like myself, or religious anti-Zionist Jews, which we can see almost daily on Instagram being beaten with clubs and so on by Israeli soldiers and police in the streets of Jerusalem or New York, right? So I mean, Israeli trained police in those cases, in other places. So it's not just happening in Palestine itself, but also happening in any spaces that anti-Zionist Jews exist. Anti-Zionist Jews like Maura Finkelstein being, fired from her job, anti-Zionist Jews like Chaim Bereshit in London being arrested, I think 78-year-old man being arrested and having to spend a night in a jail cell, you name it, right? That is what anti-Semitism looks like today. So obviously, this defense of Jewish safety, this war on anti-Semitism, this anti-Semitism counterinsurgency is not about getting rid of anti-Semitism, because if we didn't have this discursive, this thing that we're calling anti-Semitism, then everything else wouldn't be able to be logical. We couldn't have a Douglas Murray saying Hamas is worse than the Nazis and enacting Holocaust denial in the name of the defense of Zionism, because everybody would see that as anti-Semitic, because we've attached the definition of anti-Semitism to the critique of Zionism, that all becomes permissible, including very, very dangerous anti-Semitism and very, very dangerous Holocaust denial, which needs to be seen. I mean, if we're talking about genocide and understanding what genocide is, if we suddenly lose, if we lose all proportion in terms of what actually the Nazi genocide was, then we can't think about it in relation to the other genocides. And we indeed participate in this exceptionalization of the Nazi genocide, or the Holocaust, as other people call it, and its extraction from colonial genocides in general, which would give it meaning, which is, of course, what an anti-colonial, anti-racist perspective should be doing. We should be doing everything in our power to de-exceptionalize the Nazi genocide in order to show how important or significant genocides in general are over the course of modernity to the enactment of colonial racial rule.
That's enormously important analysis, and I think coming from the perspective of somebody who studies the interrelationships between Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in the pre-modern period, I have in the context of the Crusades, it really seems like very compatible analysis. But where I would put some of the recalibrations of white supremacy in this context is the way in which kind of this far right fantasy and in support for Israel is a kind of anti-Semitic fantasy of Zionism as a solution for the Jewish question
Absolutely.
that
Yeah.
that interposes the settler colonial transformation of the despised object of this form of bigotry into a kind of Western crusader, which is, of course, to link the crusader states and the project by which, kind of in the Western Catholic imagination, they fantasize themselves as the true Hebrews, like fulfilling the kind of prophecy of history in themselves as the, chosen community. And you even see this in Urban II's, sort of versions of his sermon that aggrandize the Franks as a special people of destiny who have sort of displaced the historic biblical Hebrews with the coming of a new chosen sort of people who have to materialize this through a settler colonial project of recapturing and retaking Christ's territory and reconstituting those kingdoms. So this is something that it seems that what happens is that this can be displaced um, in a new settler colonial project that recapitulates this early one and transforms Jews who are objects of crusading violence. In the first big massacres are during the preaching of the First Crusade. So. But to transform that community now into a kind of crusading settler colonial community that transforms their relationship to this Latin Christendom, the West, and makes them Westerners through the process of becoming colonizers and settler colonists, which is why it fits so well with the far right imagery and ideology of, recapturing a kind of crusading war against Islam and the Muslims, and to see, Israel as a emblematic frontier outpost of the West, which is, of course, the discourse that somebody like Netanyahu is so adept at leveraging and using in mobilizing support, is to say, well, we are the West. And so that's why Murray, as you've been talking about, can talk about this is absolutely crucial to saving Western civilization. So I really enjoyed your analysis there, because I see it as a very compatible additional component to really think through, what's at stake, in these mobilizations that you've been talking about.
Can I say one more thing, though, that I didn't touch on, which I think links to this? I mean, you mentioned before the German Staatsräson, and there's a whole aspect of my discussion there, which I think is important, because, yes, although it's very important to try to draw out the ways in which the far right, draws upon Zionism and the reasons for this apparent paradox of the alliance between the far right and Zionism. But the argument that I'm making really goes beyond that, because what I'm talking about in terms of who is this figure of the Jew in need of safety, this Jew acts as a proxy for the West or for Europe, which sees itself as in need of saving. So when we return to or when we think about the question of Germany, many people talk about German guilt as being a motivator for its obsessional protection of Israel and its repression of anybody who speaks out in favor of Palestine at all costs. But my argument that it's less about that and more in terms of the Germans placing themselves in the role of the Jew, so taking the place of the Jew who is in need of preserving or saving from the marauding other, which of course we can think of historically in terms of the Crusades, which because of course what is Europe always trying to ward off is the Muslim threat, and that's not a new problem that suddenly came up in the War on Terror, but as your work shows, has centuries long history. So of course, the Jew is the Jew in the kind of in the Zionist rendering of him or her now serves as this perfect proxy that can stand for this West in need of saving. So suddenly this, the way the Zionist discourse about it, this little state in the middle of the sea of kind of enemies, etc. Europe literally sees itself through this great replacement narrative as that little state in a sea of marauding others, even though, of course, Europe is far from being this weak entity, but needs to, much like Israel, needs to cast itself in the role of a victim in order to be able to justify its own attack, its own Islamophobic, anti-black, anti-migrant, etc. attack on anybody couched as trying to usurp. And while the language of the far right might be much more in your face when it comes to it, the practices of all of the racial states of Europe and of the West in general, thinking of Australia, where I'm located most of the time, also participate wholeheartedly, but just putting a little bit of a, nicer spin of it, which of course, we can understand in terms of our previous discussion about how various institutions of the West counterinsurgently domesticate the languages of anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and so on, in order to smooth the journey towards this kind of restatement or recapitulation of Western power, which is really what's at stake. So when Isaac Herzog, the Israeli president, says, this is a war for the preservation of Western civilization, well, yes, I mean, that's exactly what the West needs to hear. And that's the reason that it stands with Israel, and not so much because of the much hyped lobbies, nefarious as they are.
Yes, yes, yes. And in point of fact, actually, I think that kind of sense of vulnerability and victimhood in the discourse that authorizes settler colonial war, crusading, and so on goes back, a great distance. I'm very fascinated with some passages by one of the kind of key theoreticians and proponents of the Second Crusade, a very important figure, Peter the Venerable, who also was responsible not only for, a polemic against heretics, but a polemic against Jews, a kind of adversus Judaios polemical treatise, and also for the project to translate the Quran and mobilize a new library of Orientalism, you might say. That, one of the things that he says is that we're just, in a small, the 3/4 of the world has been taken by these Muslims, like, Africa, Asia, and they haven't even left all of Europe to us, thinking of Spain, which was then under, a part of the Iberian Peninsula was under Muslim rule. And he's, kind of expatiating about how threatened, they feel. And this is at the same time that he is propagandizing for, preaching, trying to raise money to support a crusade, and suggesting that perhaps we should take all this, money from Jewish money lenders to finance the crusades, right? So the
That's
interplay
in the
between,
book, actually. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah. Yeah, yeah. So, at any rate, well, this has been such a fascinating conversation with you about this new work, the new the new racial regime recalibrations of white supremacy. That is, by the time this is edited and up, it probably will be out here in May 2025. So, I encourage all listeners to go out and buy the book. Most importantly, read the book and think about it, because I think the analysis here is very significant and relevant to really rethinking what's happening in the interrelationship between these different calibrations around race and racism. And so it's such a wonderful piece of work, and I look forward to more of your work as it continues. But why don't you tell the listeners where they can keep up with you and follow, not only get this, but also follow your work. You do a lot of other writing and are engaged in a lot of other kinds of activities and online. How can listeners and viewers keep up with all that?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I've really enjoyed our conversation. It's really gratifying to hear that the work is relevant, and yeah, obviously. So yeah, I have a website, so it's alanalentin.net, where you can find various writings and news about upcoming events. I also have a Substack, just my name. And I'm currently, the only social media I'm using at the moment is Instagram, which I detest, but that's where you can also find me on the social media landscape. But yeah, probably the website and Substack are the best places for writings and so on. Yeah.
That's terrific. I don't use Instagram so much, but I used to come across you on Twitter, and now it sounds like you're fully on Instagram. And so we've missed you on Twitter X, but I can completely appreciate the reasons for leaving that site. I don't know what your reasons were, but it is
It's a
definitely a
dangerous
challenge.
space, I think. Yeah.
It is, yeah, yeah. Any rate, again, thank you so much for coming on. And again, listeners, please do check out the book, The New Racial Regime, Recalibrations of White Supremacy. And I look forward to speaking with all of you again soon. Solidarity.